And that moves us to new business. Item 10.1, presentation of the results of the New York State Education Department's testing program, and that is Tim. Okay.
Jump right into it. Thank you. All right. So, I'm going to give you an overview of the assessment results. This is from last year's 2014-15 state tests. So I have two goals for tonight. The first is to tell the story of our student performance through the lens of the state assessment system. And the second is to entertain the question, what was the impact of the students opting out of the state tests last year on our results? So we'll look at sort of a conjecture I have about that. So we're going to jump right in. I won't read through all of the background, but to highlight a few things, that we are in the third year of the Common Core test in grades 3 through 8, math and ELA. So we've had 3 years of state testing data on the new revised tests. We also, last year, administered the second Common Core test in algebra. The algebra regents is in year 2. And last year was the first geometry regents. We have not yet administered the new Common Core English regents. That will happen this year. And I'd like to put this slide up to remind you about our former Commissioner, John King, who put out a memo in 2013 when the new tests were put out. And we saw a dramatic drop in the results across the state. He made it clear that even though the results went down across New York State, that was not an indication that students were learning less or teachers were performing any worse, even though the tests were tied to teacher performance. He wanted to make that clear in the memo. So I do like to put that up just to remind us that there was a big shift in 2013 from the old standards to the new standards, to put that in context. I'll remind you that the 3 through 8 ELA and math tests have 4 performance levels. So when I speak on the next slides about level 3 and 4, that is students reaching proficiency, is level 3 and 4. I gave you this slide at the beginning of the school year. This is just the raw data on students meeting, the percent of students meeting proficiency, or all the performance levels on the 3 through 8 test by grade level. The green band in the middle is showing the students reaching the proficiency mark. Out of context, it doesn't really mean anything. So what I want to do now is put some context to this from a few different perspectives, which will give you a sense of how our students are doing as it relates to the Common Core through the lens of the state testing system. So this first slide is a broad picture comparing our performance to the performance in New York State. So the blue bar is our students' proficiency level of 3 and 4 by grade level in ELA. The red line is showing the state performance level. The first observation is that our results are generally about double what the state's performance is, which is where we would expect it to be. The thing I would look at here, what I notice on this in terms of the story, the purpose of the state test year to year is to get students prepared for high school when it becomes a high stakes test and get them ready for high school performance in the Regents exams. So you can see the state is going from 3rd grade to 8th grade with only a 4% proficiency increase, from 31% students reaching proficiency in 3rd to 35 reaching proficiency in 8th grade. Our results go up from 58 to 83, a 25% increase. So we're increasing over those 3 years at a much higher rate than the state's performance level would show, which to me is indicating that over the span of 3rd through 8th grade, we're preparing our students for high school in that regard.
But this is just a 1-year snapshot.
1-year snapshot.
We really need to see
year.
the same class progress
Which
for
will
5 years.
Yes, which we will start doing. We only have 3 years of Common Core, and I'll start looking at cohort. It is a snapshot of where we think students should be performing. Remembering that we just started Common Core over 3 years, all the standards were implemented at the same time, K through 8. So an 8th grade student in 2012 was just getting the standards for the first time versus a kindergarten student who's going through the Common Core at the beginning. We did not agree with the state's implementation, but that was the reality we had to deal with. Math, a little bit of a different story happening in math from the state level. You're seeing the decrease. I'll talk about 8th grade in a moment. And you're seeing a lot of fluctuation here. We're trying to make sense of all of these results. But putting it in the state context, you do see from 3rd to 7th, a decrease of 7 percentage points, where we have a slight increase over 3rd through 7th. 8th grade, you're seeing this big drop. If you recall, last year was the first year, 2 years ago in 2014, we were allowed the waiver so that we didn't have to double test students anymore. A lot of districts accelerate students in 8th grade, and those students take the Regents exam in 8th grade. So we have students taking the Algebra Regents in 8th. We used to have to double test those students. We used to have those students take the Algebra Regents and the 8th grade assessment. We got a waiver from the federal government to not have to do that, so we pulled those students out. So this data right here is only showing students who took the 8th grade assessment. There were 8th grade students who were accelerated that aren't in this data anymore. So statewide, you see a drop as well as in our results, because you're pulling out, in our case, 50% of the students. You would expect those results to go
What's going to
down.
happen this coming year as well?
Yes, yeah, that was made permanent. So 2014 was the first year, then 15 they got the extension, and now we can do it
Right.
forever.
Tim, is the fall off in the state, is there some anecdotal evidence that other schools also went for that exemption, meaning that's why the fall off is there?
Yes,
Statewide.
definitely.
Statewide, right?
Yeah, statewide, students do that.
Okay.
A lot of districts did that. One more snapshot comparing us to the state results. This is percentile rankings. So there are about 700 school districts in New York. So this is our percentile ranking and students reaching proficiency compared to all districts in the state. Typically, we're in the 90th percentile and better. This is showing over 3 years. You see some fluctuation from year to year. In some cases, we're consistently at the top, sometimes ranking 1, 2, or 3rd in the state. And then there's some fluctuation in between. But again, always ranking in the 90th percentile when compared to states across.
So do you look
districts across
at some of our regional peers
We
just to
look
see
at
how we
that as
stack up,
well.
given there's so
Absolutely.
much
Yep,
diversity in the
and
state?
we're generally in the top as well. You see some more subtleties and fluctuation, and again, over 3 years, we see some of this in certain grade levels with some changes going on. Not sure until a few more years we stabilize and see what's happening overall. But yeah, there's also some fluctuation regionally.
And this is also why the growth model in APPR doesn't work. If you look at math 2013 to 2015, which actually dropped, well, you're at 99%, you can't go up. And you're going to have a slight fluctuation. The growth model just doesn't work.
It doesn't work because a student may already be performing it, when your students in your class are performing at the top, and maybe the next year several students miss 1 or 2 items, it's showing that you didn't teach them anything even though they're still performing quite well. So yeah, it doesn't discriminate at the top in the model.
One other question about, I guess, cut scores and the difference between a 2 and a 3, because all this data is looking at levels 3 and 4, because that's proficiency. That's what the state has set. I would imagine that the difference between the 2 and the 3 on the margin is probably very small in terms of number of questions, and that there's probably a big cluster of people in that 2 to 3 category.
Yes.
So, I mean, does that
Yeah,
also
there's a
just
lot in there.
skew the data a bit? Or said another way, if someone scored a 3 last year, a low 3, and now they're a high 2, is that materially different from an educational standpoint?
So the state looks at bell-shaped curves, and they have sort of theories when they cluster them, and there's a lot of literature that they put out that doesn't always make sense, but they try to make these scores fall a certain way. So, yeah, it could be a matter of an item or 2 that kid misses that keeps them from a 2 and a 3. So is that a big difference in their educational performance? We're not sure, but we do look in our own analysis, and teachers get the raw scores of kids so that they actually know how their students perform and can help target the areas of weakness for students. Because to me, it's really about helping lift those students up and get them to a proficiency level eventually, or keep moving them along and having them grow.
I think even more important when you're thinking about what these scores mean, you know, what is a 1, what is a 2, what is a 3, what is a 4, the long-term plan was these scores were predictors of how you would do on your regions, which are predictors of how you do on in college and on college admissions. Those connections have not been made. So for instance, in theory, the difference between a 2 and a 3 should predict something about your Regents exams. But those correlations haven't been made yet. They're just drawing a line where they think the line belongs.
right.
You know, if you're a 298 hitter and somebody else is a 300 hitter, is he really better than you? No, somebody just drew a line.
So So starting to look at our own data, this is putting together all the students 3 through 8 over the 3 years in ELA and math and seeing the progression here. So we are seeing some upward movement in all the students' performance when put together from 2013, 2014 to 2015 in both math and ELA. So over the 3 years of the Common Core test now, we are looking for an upward trend, seeing it here. We'll dig deep into WAMPUS and then Crittenden also. First, looking at students with disability, obviously a lot less, but we're still outperforming the state by about 3 times. The state results are about a third of this. And again, we are seeing some movement here in an upward trend, but these are small numbers. Generally, looking year to year, we need a lot more data on that. It's hard to look at trends with just small cohorts of this size because they're so different year to year.
Now, is this anybody with an IEP?
With IEP, yes, not 504.
So it could be vision, it could be hearing, where
Right.
they have compensation, and
So it is hard to group this to look at it, but it is worth a comparison because it is one way to disaggregate a subpopulation. But the groups are
It's
so
also a way
different
of
from.
penalize school districts.
yeah.
Looking at it that way, yeah. Looking at WAMPUS, we had this incredible surge last year in grades 3 and 5 in WAMPUS, if you recall, in both ELA and math, which made those results jump pretty dramatically. So it looks like a drop from 14 to 15, but looking at it over the 3 years, we still see an increase of 5 points there and 7 points in mathematics. So that's showing that trend. Looking at it from year to year, again, the year-to-year change seems to be having some negative change from 14 to 15 in the year-to-year grade level comparison, and then the same for math. But again, why it's interesting to look at it a little more broadly, because I recall that in 2014 we saw some dramatic increase. Looking at it from 2013 to 14, this is how third grade performed in 2013 to 2015. When we look at that at each grade level in ELA, we're seeing an upward trend in each grade.
But don't we do third grade in 2013, fourth grade
I'll do
in
that as well. That's on the next
2014?
slides.
Yeah.
Yeah, looking at cohort, but we do want to look at grade level from year to year. I know it's different students, but it's also how the grade's performing from year to year. And we would hope that we're continuing to move students up as we eventually want to get more students reaching proficiency at younger
Yeah,
grades.
but we know that every grade is
It's different. Yeah.
different.
Yep. And again, looking at it in math here, you see this big increase. We had a dramatic increase over the 2 years in mathematics at WAMPUS with the Common Core.
I guess the other issue with all these comparisons, though, which you can't help, is with the 2015 opt-outs, there's a question of the opt-outs from our district, but then beyond that, when you look at the pool of numbers from the state, you have so many opt-outs that the comparisons are almost, I don't want to say meaningless, but certainly not
Sure.
directly, linear.
Questionable.
Right.
Yeah.
And then doing the same for Crittenden, we'll look at Crittenden's data, looking at ELA from 2013 to the first Common Core administration to 2015. An upward trend despite last year having a little bit of drop there, and also seeing the upward trend in mathematics. And again, year to year, looking at it over 1 year is one thing, but let's look at it over the 2 years from the start of the Common Core tests to here. We did see a decline in 7th grade, which is something we're looking at, and then also in 8th in mathematics, seeing the upward note. And again, I have a note about the cohort here because of the change in the waiver. Now we'll start looking at the same group of students. We have 3 years to look at, so I'm looking at them in 3-year groups to follow the cohort over 3 years. So there's a lot happening on here. This is English Language Arts. We're looking at the percent of students reaching 3 or 4 over the 3 years of the Common Core, the red, the blue, and the orange. So this is the graduating class of 2022. This is our current 6th grade students. And this is how they performed last year in 2015, their proficiency level on the orange bar, and the year before how those students did in 4th grade, and the year before how they did in 3rd grade, their first administration of the Common Core. So you can see from the blue to the orange was a 6% increase in students reaching proficiency for that group of students. So now we're starting to look at the cohort, which tells a different story of their performance and change over time. When you look at another cohort, the next grade up, our current 7th grade students from 4th, 5th, and 6th. From 4th grade to 6th grade, you see a 16% increase in their proficiency level. The next grade from 5th to 7th, while we had that jump in 6th and it going down in 7th, it is still a +3 in proficiency level from 5th to 7th. And then 6th, 7th, 8th, again, it's from 6th to 8th, there is a 7% increase in proficiency over the 3 years of the cohort. Again, we can get a little into trouble by looking at 1 year at a time, but continuing to follow the cohort. Our goal is to get them ready for the high school. Ms. Bill said, while these were meant to be predictors, we don't think the state is there yet, but at least we're watching the cohort grow each year.
I guess the one thing on that slide that pops out is that the 7th, in 2 cohorts, in 2020 and 19, you see a dip in 7th grade.
Right.
That could be for a lot of different reasons,
Right.
but is that one of the things that you'll
That our
think
data-
about and look into?
Yes, yeah, so we'll dig a little deeper to see what's
It
happening.
could be that the test was not valid or
Right.
less valid.
Right.
It could be a poor test that year.
Sure.
Probably the tests are good, but even at that, it doesn't actually mean anything. One of the difficulties we have is, I mean, I think it feels good that all of these are plus, that if you're, I mean, who cares if your child goes up or down 1 year? You want to know that over time,
Over time.
that's all pluses. So that part feels good. We also don't know what's a significant increase.
Right.
You know, we don't know, you know, I can almost assure you that a +3 is probably not a statistically significant increase.
Mhm.
I would guess a +16 is, but we don't know what 1 standard deviation is, or 2 standard deviations, or what's a significant score, or what's not a significant score. We don't even, I think the cutoff between 2 and 3, actually I'm not so confident about the cutoff, but I am pretty sure that 3 represents mastery, you know, like good proficiency. But I don't know that that's been statistically established.
Well, I've always heard that the 3 coincides to an A- on the PISA test, which is the test of all tests when everybody compares the U.S. to everybody else around the world. Whether that's a good test or not, you know, I'm not
Yeah.
going to opine on, but
compare it to the rest of the world or
but
not,
they've
but-
done a lot of like cross-referencing, and it
Yeah.
sounds like
And the PISA test, you know, I believe is really interesting and significant to look at, but that hasn't been correlated to success in college, or
For
success
sure.
getting into college, or success in life, or, you know, countries that do well on PISA, the gross national product tends to decline. You know,
But it
Right.
gets you votes if you're running for office.
well,
it's what what all the
if you
politicians
can talk
say.
about it, yeah.
Yeah, right.
So take all of this with, you know, a big grain of salt. We think it's good stuff for us to study.
It's good that the trend is up.
And it's good that it's up. It's better
It's
than
good that
down.
it's up.
Right.
And on the big picture, it does feel right.
Does
So
feel right.
we do have, you know, at any test, regardless of where we're falling, even here, we would want to look at that test and see what standards are we underperforming in and
Yeah,
why.
exactly.
And what we used to do is go back and look at the test items and actually do item analysis and look at our own students' work and have teachers really go deep into it. The state's taken that away from us. We can't look at the tests anymore. in our
They
own
wanted
students.
to sell it back to us with a software company and a package.
That's another story.
That's the data and
That's the data.
the really ugly thing that was going on.
Yeah.
Yes, they want, that's why they didn't get back to us. And they could take a kid's test and they could say, the kid did poorly in these 5 questions, which are this topic, and then they sell you a software piece that's designed to teach that topic to the kid. It was going to be free for the first 2 years.
Yeah.
That's off the table.
Trial
Off
subscription,
the table.
kind of like Apple Music.
What is the requirement now from the state for AIS for 1s and 2s? Where are they coming out on that? I guess how does the district handle that?
Right, so they've allowed us to, it used to be for 1s and 2s, but they've changed it to a low 3 cut mark. Again, arbitrary, but because we were inundated with number of students with the change in tests. So we still do that, but also the framework we now use that is a better way to look at it is response to intervention, RTI, which is dealing with it in real time in the classroom or during the school year, as opposed to waiting to this one benchmark and then after the fact giving kids services. The RTI approach does it in real time, so we do benchmark assessment throughout the year. When we notice students struggling, we do interventions to help get that student ready for this year's assessment and not wait until that one.
Actually tests that help the students rather than.
Exactly.
Hey, Tim, did I hear you right that you said that now instead of 1 and 2s, it's also low 3s that get with?
No, they changed it, so they moved it down into.
Mid-twos.
They took the mid-2, sorry, I said mid-3s.
Like
Oh,
1.5.
Yeah,
Okay.
like 1.5 you have to give it to, and the upper 2s are optional.
Optional to the
Yeah.
school district or to the
Yes,
families?
at this point, 2 school districts. It was mandated AIS for the 1s and the low half of the 2s.
What was the state's thinking about that, the long, was it
Will be-
costs or?
I think they're in a bind with their own thinking,
It was
is really
Yes.
what's
arbitrary
Yeah,
cut score change.
they want 3 to represent proficiency. In theory, anything below proficiency should get help. The numbers were out of control in terms of the cost to district. And also, it was about 70% of students needed extra help, which is, kind of absurd to begin with. So, what happened, I think, essentially is they wanted scores to look bad so they can make their point that public schools are not performing. Once they made them look bad, they had this problem of, now they need extra help,
Right.
but they don't really need extra help.
Right.
So
Make it
instead of 2,
discretionary.
it's going to be 1.5.
Yeah.
And I think the best proof of this is if you look at our numbers, in the state, about 30%, I believe, of students reach proficiency.
Yes.
Yep.
Here, we're talking 50, 60%.
Right.
75% of those kids are getting into tier 1 and 2 colleges. How can they not be proficient? They're excelling extraordinarily well by the real standard that everybody cares about.
Right.
Our average student at the 50th percentile is getting into a tier 1 college.
Right.
And they're saying might not be proficient. So I think they've backed themselves into a contradiction, I think.
I guess the other question on the regents, as they flip over to these Common Core Regents tests, and the regents are going to be on college transcripts. And I know you guys dealt with this issue last year, I guess, with the math, and won the battle of allowing people to take 2 tests. For the tests coming up this year that are flipping, will that same dynamic hold, or are people stuck taking the new test only?
Yeah.
They've announced.
Yeah, so in geometry, students had that option. The first administration of the Common Core, they allowed the double testing. And then in the second year, they take that option away.
So it's the first
So
year
it's
of
the
every
first
new
year.
test that's initiated.
Yeah, they're following that trend.
Did families get these results yet? Did they get mailed home to families?
Yes, the families have access to them through the portal.
Okay.
No longer mail.
Oh,
They
no
now do
longer
it through
mail,
the
that's
portal.
right. Oh,
Yeah,
that
so
is-
they are
of course.
available. The results,
I'm
the
dating
parent
myself.
reports have been
Yep.
sent out and notices have been sent to parents.
Is our guidance department on high alert to make sure that colleges know that when these new tests are rolled out, the GPA, it will have a GPA impact? And if you're competing against someone from Chappaqua, that'll be very clear, but if you're competing against someone from a private school or from another state, it's not.
On the Regents exams, right?
It's just communication, that's all. I mean, nothing you can do about it, but important to.
I think the good news is the colleges probably have a lot more confidence in us than, I'm not even sure they pay attention to
Right,
Regents.
that's, I would have to say
Regents-
that.
Our kids tend to do very well in Regents. They're well prepared for most of
Yeah.
their.
Colleges reconfigure the GPA in their own way. Our GPA, we send to them and says no meaning to them, to tell you the truth, tier 1 colleges.
And Regents, they can't compare to anybody outside of the state, so.
Right.
Right. So maybe state schools use them in some way, but for a district like ours, I don't know if it matters. Math results similar from going over the 3 years, seeing the change over the 3 years. I just make a note about the one group here where this is not the same cohort of students, because that's the year we pull out the students who took algebra. So we're not comparing the same students there, and it looks like a drop. If we were to put in the students on the Common Core algebra regents, that number would go way up. And we'll look
We
at
should almost stop reporting 8th grade math.
I know, just about, yeah. Just about. I put the science here. These results are very consistent over time, so I don't do any comparison because they don't really fluctuate too much, but students reaching level 3 and 4 and the percentage of 4s remains constant.
Sorry,
These are excellent results.
Is the reason for that on math is that the children that aren't in advanced math then would be the only population in that score, so.
They're
schools
showing
would
up
be
with the
driven-
high school students because
Okay.
they're taking, yeah, the top math students are not showing up as eighth graders, they're
Right,
showing
so
up
you,
as
so your
ninth
data
graders.
pool is really your less, your students that
Less
remain in school, I got it, okay.
Non-advanced.
Right, okay.
And we'll look at that data in a moment. So with the...
And if you go back, I mean, Tim pointed this out to me, you know, this stuff is so interesting because there's statistics and there's statistics. The reason the scores are always about the same is because they're taking a normal curve and laying it over the scores and then determining where kids are, so we keep getting the same scores.
And sometimes it's 3 wrong, sometimes it's 5 wrong, it's the same score.
It's always a normal curve,
It's
isn't that
always a normal
interesting?
And the only time we see fluctuation is when they start playing with it.
Right.
And we notice it, we're like, something happened, and then the listservs start buzzing. And then we have to, someone asks the state, and then we get an explanation. So we find that out because we all talk to each other and compare our results with one another. So we can tell when the state's tinkering with their model a little bit, because it shows up in our districts. And we notice it because we're all looking at it carefully.
They did the same thing with teachers' performance.
Yeah, they're all just laid.
Yeah, that's why it takes so long
We
to get all these
can't-
results.
We
Let's
can't
face
have
it,
such good results, let's tinker.
That's right.
they're
We
graded
get-
by what, May or so, and then it takes until September, October, so something has to happen in those many months.
There's a lot of statisticians getting hired in that time. We'll take a look at the Regents data now. I think I pointed out most of this information already, so this is all a repeat. So this English score, this is the last administration of the old Regents, and this was an expanded group of students. This is a small number of students, so it's not really worth looking at. I just put it there as a record that we had it there. This isn't typical of our performance, and it's not most of our students. It's a small cohort. This is our global history and our U.S. history Regents exams. The blue bar is representing students passing. We also look at the mastery rate, which on a Regents exam is scoring an 85 to 100. And again, these results have been very consistent with just minor fluctuations over time, so I don't compare them year to year. Same thing in science. These results have been really consistent and show the excellence over time. We've had these results for
Sorry, Tim,
quite some
and
time.
I don't need the exact number, the range of students taking each exam or in each grade is in 50 to 75 students. How many students are taking this exam?
In each of these, so with the exception of here, this is all of our students. Every student takes
Okay, okay.
these.
About 200.
Yeah, it's about 200 students per grade level running it. And same thing here with sciences, there may be a handful of students that take other options instead of some of these Regents, but all students have to pass 5 Regents exams, 1 in each subject as a graduation requirement.
Not just pass. Now, for a Regents exam, you've got to have like 80 or something better
On the Common Core,
on the Common Core
You know,
Regents. Otherwise,
that's
it's
going to be
a-
coming up. That's
it's a
not yet,
local
but it will
diploma if you don't do that.
eventually by 2022, and I'll point that out in a moment as well. So looking at math, again, the integrated algebra, this was an expanded group. This is the last administration. It's a small cohort of kids. This is our second administration of the Common Core. I'll talk about that in a moment. So we did administer both geometry Regents. This year was the first administration of the Common Core.
Quite a
You can
difference.
sort of see what they're doing here. The passing rate is in the ballpark. Seems we're very comfortable with that rate. You see a big change in the mastery, and the Common Core tests are discriminating more at the top. They're making them harder at the top level, not so much in the middle, but for these students. So that drop is interesting. Maybe this will change and go up. I'll show you something on the Common Core, which is or on the algebra test, which is some more data. So these are our 2 administrations of the Common Core algebra Regents. Passing rate, a little bit down, but in the ballpark there. You saw us double the mastery rate from 15% to 32% in the mastery of that. So this wasn't typical. This was the first administration. Remember, these kids only started the Common Core standards in 7th grade. This is only their 3rd year of Common Core because the state just laid it down and started testing those kids immediately instead of letting the curriculum follow the kids and build with them. So these kids did not have as much of a background in the Common Core standards as the next year, and then our understanding of the expectations also. So we were given not a lot of information on what was going to be tested differently and what it would look like. So over time, you would hope that we would start getting a little better at understanding the expectations and working on that, not just in algebra, but in the K-12 sequence is still trying to understand better how we can have kids access the curriculum. And Brett was referring to this. This will be the new expectations for the graduate of the year 2022. Currently, students can meet proficiency at this level, in ELA and math going at 65 for both. Starting in 2022, proficiency or passing will be a level 4, which is 79 for ELA on the scale score and 74 for mathematics. This is what the state determined was college and career readiness. And the alignment that they did, this was going back probably about 6 years when they've done a study and came up with these marks. So these will be the new ways the regents will be looked at, the Common Core tests, starting with the class of 2022. So when we're saying students passing, right now we're talking this number, eventually we'll have to get to this number.
So we got rid of the local diploma option some time ago and only offer the Regents diploma. But it looks like we're going to have to sort of revert back to...
Well, the Regents diploma is required, and that was, all students had to pass the 5 Regents exams.
We didn't choose to get rid of the
Yeah.
local, we didn't have a choice.
Yeah. We didn't have a choice. In fact, we were in violation for a few years, I just said that on camera, but we were in violation for a few years by not reporting it as Regents, and we had to do that, because we kept it as a local.
If we had our druthers, every student would receive a Byram Hills diploma, and there would be no designation that it's Regents or Regents Plus or local. You know, at that point, walk across the stage and get your diploma, and they're all equal.
Yeah.
Right.
And colleges don't care.
Right.
This is just excessive bureaucratic.
So getting to next steps, we'll continue to do our curriculum work. We're currently working on our K-5 literacy and bringing in some new frameworks, and have been doing a lot of work around that. Next year, I anticipate doing a study of math programs K-5 in need of a new program because our old program isn't being aligned to the Common Core. So we'll be doing that study next year. We're currently looking at social studies and revising our K-12 social studies curriculum aligned to the new social studies frameworks, which are new last year. We've been doing a lot of groundwork on that already. And then we're waiting for January to see what the state does with science, although we're not really waiting. We've been doing work for several years on the next gen science standards. But in January, the state is supposed to release new science standards K-12, which we anticipate will be fairly aligned to the next generation science standards K-5. And at the secondary level will be a few changes, but probably not too dramatic.
Can you go to your previous page 20? Oh, that's, sorry, I may have jumped ahead on you. I wanted to
I
see
switched
your,
mine around a little bit, so
the conjecture on the opt-in.
I'm going to get there, yeah.
Okay.
I'll do that in a second, sure. I just wanted to end the state portion. I put this picture in just to remind us that it's really about what happens day to day in our classrooms, and that we're preparing students to be great learners for the future. And this is a reminder that it's about student performance on a day-to-day basis, not this one-time snapshot. Although we do look at the snapshot and it tells us some trends, that's just a one measure at a point in time, and it's a big picture that we do have to
Just
look
thinking how
deeper.
much more you could do for us, we have to saddle you with this.
Oh, yeah, that would be.
Seriously, how much more you could do if you weren't saddled with this? To me, it's just,
It's sad.
I'll leave it there.
Well, you know, on a day-to-day basis, so I go in the classrooms and I work with teachers and I work with students, and that's where we do the real work, and we know that.
That's great, thank you.
So we want to get to the impact. So this will be my staff report for this evening, so I'll do it now, which is asking that question, well, what was the impact? Can we anticipate what it is? So I made a conjecture about this. So what I'm saying is, what if we took the students who opted out in 2015 and we said, what if those students scored the same in 2015 if they took the test that they scored the previous year in 2014? What if we took their scores and put it into our data? What impact would that have? So that's what I did, and we'll take a look at that. So here were just the raw numbers. These are the number of students who opted out. So for example, in 4th grade, we had 9 students opt out of the state test. 7 had received a level 1 or 2, and 2 had received a level 3 or 4. And in math, we had...
In the previous year.
In 2014, yes. This is their 2014 score. And in math, it was 13 students, 6 had scored level 1 or 2, 7 had scored level 3 or 4 the previous year. So you can see when we highlight where the majority falls, mostly here, it's 4 out of the 5 levels aired on the side. More students were level 1, 2, we had the one there. 3 out of the 5 in math. We did have a tie here. This is about even. These are pretty close together. So I took that raw data, threw it into our current data, and this is what we come up with. So in ELA, for example, in 4th grade, this was our actual results. If those students had performed the same and took the test, we would have had 62% reaching proficiency, which is a change of negative 3%, going down from our actual to the conjecture of this. And so you sort of see both in the ELA and math where that would fall. It's mainly down, between 1 and 3 generally, -4 there, +1 there, and some hovering around 0, just a little below 0 here. Now, it's making a big assumption. It's assuming that we made no progress with those students.
Right.
However, if you looked at our cohort data, when you see what happens with cohorts, we always move students up. So I would anticipate that we would actually have moved some of those students up, and this data would be a little either 0 or hovering between -1 to +1, somewhere in that ballpark, that probably we would have seen very little impact if those students actually took the test, very little change from what the actual results were. It's my hypothesis, may not be true, but it was just one way to ask ourselves. We have small numbers. We have 4% in ELA and 6% in math who opted out compared to the statewide opt-out, which was 20%.
And the state gave a little bit of guidance in saying that there were more 1s and 2s that opted out than 3s and 4s, although there were plenty of everybody.
Right.
But they didn't give any statistical guidance, did they?
No, I would love to see how they're analyzing it.
Because
I would love to
presumably
know
they
that.
could have done the same analysis for the state.
Exactly.
It's statistically insignificant.
Exactly.
Right.
So that's what I would say
For us.
for us. So just thought it was worth a look, just to ask ourselves, well, what is it? Just so we know, I would say it's statistically insignificant in terms of the
Even in a
impact.
conservative framework, it's
Yes.
statistically insignificant.
Yeah.
That's my report.
Thank you.
I reiterate what I said a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
I second it.
Really, it's almost shameful.
Yeah, Tim, thank you. I mean,
Sure.
the detail in this is fantastic.
Great,
This is
Tim.
stuff that
Thank
we
you
need
very
to
much.
see,
Thanks
and I
for
really
your
appreciate it.
Really.
Okay.
It's
Thank
almost
you.
like your version of the equalization formula. Really, and you explained it.
Makes us
Yeah.
miss Greg
Crossover.
less.
Yeah, really, yeah.
It's almost like he's here.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Might want to do that for the employment data for the Federal Reserve.
Oh, my gosh. All right, then, we will move on to item 10.2, which is the New York State School Board Association 2015 Proposed Bylaws, Amendments, Resolutions, and Voting Delegate Guide. And I think I'm turning this over to Brett, right? You take over?
Yeah, it's tough to follow financial jokes, though. They don't get much better than that, huh? What everybody has in their packet is the resolutions booklet from the State School Boards Association. And Scott and I spent a few hours on the phone today. Well, let me back up. We spent a few hours at a Westput meeting with people from all over Westchester and Putnam County talking about these resolutions one by one to see if there was a regional consensus on these things. And we've identified where there was a regional consensus. And now we spent a couple of hours today talking about recommendations for how we would anticipate voting at the annual business meeting coming up in October. The one important caveat, and if we come out of here with any sort of understanding by the board, is that a lot of these resolutions, the devil is in the detail in terms of what happens when they hit the floor, and there might be an amendment that clarifies or changes them significantly. A lot of these things are broad brush, and you kind of, well, if you interpret it this way, no. If you interpret it that way, yes. And there could be clarity that really comes from these friendly or hostile amendments on the floor. So with that background, we have three categories of things to talk about. Things that are worthy of particular note, that we recommend sort of voting the same way as the Resolutions Committee recommends voting for the resolution. recommended for adoption, but possibly we might vote no on it. And we could talk about those. And then there are some resolutions that the Resolutions Committee did not recommend that they be adopted, and we might disagree with that, and, if it comes up for a vote on the floor, might vote in favor of them. With that, I wanted to just talk very briefly about the status of our 5-year renewable 10-year resolution that we did in 2010. And it becomes, this is the NYSBA position statements for 2015. This is the official lobbying position on all these issues by NYSBA. And in it on page 8 is the 5-year renewable 10-year from our resolution 5 years ago. It may sunset next year. I'm still looking for information on that, and if that's the case, we might be back here a year from now with a recommendation or a resolution to sort of renew that. That said, the three things, and Scott, you should jump in at any time and clarify or add or correct anything that I might say. And the three resolutions that we're going to go along with the recommendation from the Resolutions Committee, but we wanted to make a point about them is number 10 on the worksheet, which is to support legislation that grants to all public schools the same exemptions from New York education law and regulation that are granted to charter schools. It seems like a no-brainer. But these are the kind of resolutions that are being put out at the business meeting, and it's the discussion that's happening at the state level now with legislators, and don't create such an uneven playing surface that you burden school districts unnecessarily.
And the classic example of that is teacher evaluations, because some of the charter schools get exemptions and none of the public schools have been able to get any exemption. That's just one example of probably many different categories of regulation where it's uneven.
The other is number 12 on the worksheet, legislation that would require design and validation of APPR. This this one I want to spend a little bit more time on because it's probably the most important resolution I think that is happening at the business meeting. And it also was authored from the Brewster District, one of our regional districts, and of course the fellow who's the president of the Brewster District is also the president of West Putt. And so everybody on West Putt had a hand in helping craft this resolution. But it has also been probably the most important voice or concern that we've expressed over the past couple of years is how broken the APPR system is, and how it needs to be essentially scrapped and redesigned from the bottom up with a group of actual experts in the field and come up with some valid way to evaluate teachers. We talked about the growth score, how that doesn't work. That whole growth model was designed to measure whether a student was progressing. There could be a gazillion reasons why a student progresses or not. A teacher is certainly an important part, but there could be all kinds of other factors that go into it. It was never designed to measure teachers. Anyway, number 12. Give me 1 second on this, because you'll note on your worksheet that one of the resolutions that was not recommended for adoption was this, we want the New York State School Boards Association to express no confidence in the current APPR system. I think that's number 28 off the list.
Oh, the APPR, yeah, 20,
Yeah,
right.
so the school district that drafted that one that didn't make it into recommendations for approval contacted Steve up in Brewster and wanted to do a friendly amendment. He's totally up for it, so there'll be an amendment on the floor that will take his APPR, redesign and find a valid system, and in addition, express no confidence in the current system.
Well, how do we feel about that? How do you both feel about that?
I think the stronger the better.
Yeah.
I have absolutely no confidence.
Yeah.
It can't be strong enough for me, really.
And I think that the way that it is written here, although it obviously still has an important role to play in trying to shape opinion, if you can put no confidence in it, it does make it much stronger. That is the single most important one on the page, I totally agree. And there are a lot of amendments here, and sometimes the importance gets lost in the fact that there are so many.
Right.
But I think anything that could be done to strengthen number 12 would be great.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to add any of that, anything to that, Bill, but this is so consistent with the superintendents, the vocal superintendents in Lower Hudson Valley.
Absolutely.
The other resolution recommended for adoption that we wanted to highlight for everybody's attention as something that's particularly significant in this year was the Veterans Benefits Amendment. And I'm looking at...
Number 14.
Number 14.
Yeah.
I have the resolutions in the, I gotta get my cheat sheet out because they're numbered differently than in the book itself.
It says support the state assuming responsibility for subsidizing veterans' tax exemption.
Right. And so, by way of background, the state essentially offered an unfunded mandate, but it was an opportunity for any municipality to give tax credits to various veterans groups, and the tax credit is progressive depending upon whether the person was in active duty, combat duty, and length of time, things like that.
Was it actually a mandate, or was
Well,
it a
it
suggestion?
was a law that the state passed and said, if you approve it at your local, you're right, it was not a mandate in that sense, but it was clearly unfunded. It was an unfunded
Definitely funded.
benefit available to veterans, which are, just an incredibly sympathetic part of our community, as are police officers and first responders of all types, and but there's no tax benefit proposed for those categories of people. But and some communities have passed it, some communities have denied it, and some communities are studying it. And now, statewide, if this resolution passes, our lobbyists, the New York State School Boards Association in Albany, will press for legislation to really, this resolution says subsidize. If we were to pass the benefit, the state would have to subsidize it. I believe there will be an amendment from the floor that says fully funded. And, it's sort of like agreeing, I'm going to buy Joyce dinner provided that you pay for it.
Right.
It's I'm buying Joyce anything. It's it's got to be up to Robin. So it's and that is how we would also recommend we deal with that issue at our own in our own community, in our own district right now, because I think that's the right way to handle it. So
Well, that's not an action item for us right now.
No, but I will come back and report, and Scott and I will report on what happens at this, and if this passes, then we'll be tracking it in Albany.
All right, well, are there other ones that you wanted to highlight as well?
Well, we have a couple that were recommended for adoption, but we may not vote in support of them. And
When you're saying we may, you mean you and Scott? Or
Yeah.
which ones?
The state intervention in districts which have been financially mismanaged. This was something we viewed as an issue of local control. I don't know, Scott, if you want to say more about this particular resolution.
You know, I think the issue with the resolution right now, as we all spoke about it at the WestPUD meeting, is it is quite vague. It's not specific, and so it's very hard to know where they're purporting the line should be drawn, and it's a complicated question. And so do you want to be authorizing them very
Carte blanche,
vaguely
yeah.
rather than understanding what they're really after?
If, I look through these, I look at the recommendations, what have you, and I assume for the most part, we're going to follow the recommendations of the committee. But if it's the intention of either Brett or Scott, depending on who has the buzzer at the meeting, to vote contrary to the recommendation, putting aside the issue of potential amendments, which I understand, we should at least give a consensus for that.
Well, that's this one, and this was also a WestPUT consensus that we can't both argue for local control and permit or encourage
State
a
involvement.
vague standard for coming in and taking over a district. There are already avenues that SED can take if they believe that a school board member or a school board has breached their fiduciary duty. The commissioner can come in and start removing school board members, but they have to make the case that they breached their fiduciary duty. Well, if you financially mismanage a district, you breached your fiduciary duty of care to that district. So, you know, it just gave everybody a queasiness, I guess, is the best way to put it.
Yeah, and I don't think everybody in the room had a visceral negative reaction to the state at times coming into a district when it's necessary, but the question is when and at what point and what are we talking about? Right now, it's
That
just
one
very-
may
I
evolve
would
on
assume
the
that
floor.
would be fleshed out more on the floor.
And maybe it would be, and if it is, then, you know, at some point, I think there could be a role for the state, but you
Yeah.
just have to draw the line very, very clearly.
So here's the entire resolution, that the New York State School Boards Association support a system of state intervention in the management and operation of schools and districts determined to have been financially mismanaged, period.
Well, that could apply to very high-performing districts.
It is, that
Suppose
is.
they could have Chapaway, you know, you could have, or Byram Hills, you could have put X and Y column, and we think that's financial mismanagement, so you're on the list.
Right.
I agree. It
Right.
does, it needs a lot of work before that's ready for a serious, well, vote.
Right.
And even the resolutions committee, which were recommending this for adoption, said that, you know, should be a definite sunset provision on it and strict controls, but it's not in the
30 minutes.
resolution. And,
So I'll agree with 30-minute sunset.
yeah,
provision.
so that's the no, recommended no. In the other is number 18, which is this support programs and policies to expand access to AP, IB, or other enrichment programs that are offered through online delivery. And I guess I'm going to lump this with two more and talk about all of them globally, because I think it's a little bit of an upstate, downstate funding issue. Number 21 and number 22 are respectively incorporate pre-K funding into the school aid formula and make a pre-K transportation an aidable expense. And these are essentially individual items that, if the resolution passes and the law is changed, create funding mechanisms for very specific things. And there are very specific things that don't really benefit the downstate community very much at all. You've got remote communities up there, 2 kids interested in an AP class, can you offer it online, you know, kind of thing, and can you create a state funding mechanism for that? And our sense at West Putt was that fully restore aid to the schools and eliminate GEA all the way, and give people the money and they can use it at their discretion.
That's a great
Rather
point.
than, and
First,
currently.
and then we can
That's a
talk
great
about
point.
these.
Then we can talk about the other things.
Let's
And-
get the K-12 money back first.
And as far as the pre-K transportation and putting pre-K into school aid formulas, currently I understand that pre-K special ed is paid for at the county level. And if it's now aidable and it should be paid for at the district level, the sense is this is sort of a slippery slope to put all pre-K expenses on the districts. Fine, we'll make them aidable, we'll make it, put in your school aid formulas, but, we don't want to take on that funding burden. So again, it was the one bucket theory. If there's limited amount of money, put it in GEA, restored the school aid formula, fully fund school aid,
And this was-
eliminate GEA.
This was the feeling at West Putt?
Yes.
These three as
Yes.
well, then?
Yes.
Okay.
So it is a little bit of an upstate, downstate issue, unfortunately, but that was the sense here.
All right, well, you have to look out for our taxpayers.
Yeah,
Yep.
and the last couple are in the category of proposed resolutions not recommended for adoption, but we think we might actually vote in favor, or we would recommend that this district vote in favor. And they're number 25 and 26 on the worksheet here, which is their NISBA resolutions, essentially to make NISBA more transparent. That the NISBA compensation of its employees should be available to its members, and that NISBA will make the names of all of the donors and the amounts of the donation information available at a minimum to its membership. So currently, NISBA, it's kind of an odd duck. It's a not-for-profit corporation, so it doesn't have to have public disclosure of compensation, for example, of all of its members, or identify who's giving them money for certain things. But all of the employees have public pensions. And that's-
I agree with these.
That's
two.
why I said it's an odd duck. And
I think the transparency is important.
the fear, Ira, is that, with the way things are negotiated in Albany, that because they're public pensions, I mean, that could change. The legislature could, going forward, reduce and eliminate the pensions for the NISBA employees, all future employees. That's it. And, how much does that play into what NISBA's role is in lobbying? How much gravitas do they have when they come to the table, and are they subject to sort of Albany negotiation tactics?
How much money we give this per year?
Do you know off the top?
I don't remember what the
I know.
budget
It's
is.
a
Isn't
budget.
It's
It's a
Isn't
couple
that the
$1,000.
classic thing about surprising the superintendent of meetings with
Yeah,
information he hasn't been
it's
prepared for?
classic, yeah.
Well,
But anyway, but the point is, it is a
Future
significant amount of money.
information, we'll put that out there.
It is a significant amount of money, and they should be transparent with it.
Absolutely.
I really agree with this. I mean, it's enough. They would come out of the shadows. What are you doing with your money? What are you paying your employees?
Where their
What are you using? Where's the
constituency?
money going? Why in the Lord's name should this be something that's, they just get it and keep it under cloak?
No justification.
There really isn't. And the only justification is past practice, and that doesn't necessarily
I'll tell you
mean
what it
should do
is. General funds expenditure range, we're in the $80,000 to $100,000.
That's a significant piece of taxpayer change.
I think it's about $10,000, the
So
annual dues.
I would have no
I think it
problem
is,
with
yeah.
us voting in favor of that. I'd be in favor.
And we won't be the only ones, it sounds. I mean, I think
Alright.
there's
Yeah, I would.
a feeling, at least in this region,
You
It's
guys,
time for transparency.
You did a great job of distilling this for us, both of you. Thank you very much.
There's one more that's, and we may come back to you, there are a couple of districts around that are raising the question as to whether or not they pay the NISBA dues going forward for next year. We'll see how this plays out.
Wasn't that raised last year or the year before, that
Last
issue?
year.
Yeah,
It was.
but, you know, I think the NISBA's reaction on these two amendments are going to be kind of telling, and, you know, people are going to have to start voting with their feet if
I
they just
agree.
really want to play hardball with their books.
It sounds like it's going to be a very long day.
There's one other resolution that was not recommended by the committee that we may vote for, and that's a very interesting one, 29, which is to promote legislation that parents and guardians are the best qualified to determine educational needs of their children and whether or not they should take these state tests in math and ELA in grades 3 through 8. And right now, districts are penalized if they don't have, 95% in any cohort take these tests. And, you know, since the tests are, we are required by state law to administer the tests. That's the best way to put it. It is not a violation of state law for a kid not to show up or to opt out, let me say that. It might be a breach of our duties as school board members to encourage that and to promote that because we're obligated by state law to offer the tests. But there, you know, this opt-out movement is really a growing movement, which is essentially a voice of we're mad as hell and we're not going to take it
Right.
anymore with
Yeah,
all these state
it's
tests.
a voice of frustration. I'm not necessarily sure it's a voice, it's a knowledgeable voice that really understands what it is they're opting out or why they're doing it, as
Right.
opposed to simply saying, we've been stepped on so long, this is something we can sink our teeth into, we're not gonna do it. And I do not agree that parents and guardians are necessarily the best qualified to determine the educational needs of their children by fully supporting this opt-out. They may have other interests and they may be valid,
Mhm.
but as written here, I would not support this
It
record
it
for
also
adoption.
concerns me with support from local school districts. What does that exactly mean?
Well, I
wouldn't support it.
I would have that language stricken right out of it. I wouldn't
Yeah.
support it if it said
Right.
with the support of the school.
I like the stalking horse nature of it, actually. I understand it, but this almost is taking something further than I would go.
I feel the
that's my
same way.
view.
That one makes me uncomfortable.
This, they just did this in Ohio. It's not without precedent. It's starting to happen. Because it's just putting power into the hands of parents.
With the
Well-
school district backing it, though,
No,
it sounds like,
no,
no,
not with the
okay.
school district, no.
Okay.
And here's,
Okay.
Ira, here's another sort of angle on it, that, you know, when Tim went through these numbers, he showed there's a slight bias towards people who scored 1s and 2s opting out in a little bit greater percentage than people who've scored 3s and 4s. If you start with the premise that some kids are way too over-tested, they're high-stakes tests, they're stressful, and you put them in a situation now where they have do they have time and a half for state tests? All right, so now instead of, this is a third grader, you know, you should give the parents a right to say, this is too much for my kid. And yeah, the school district loses a data point, and the state doesn't have that data point, but it might be the best for that kid.
It might be, but I am not necessarily convinced that parents and/or guardians are necessarily the best judges of that, as much as I believe parents must be advocates for their children. And in this particular area, which right now has a very strong political cachet to it, and I understand it, I'm not so sure the premise behind this
It
is
is
accurate.
political.
So
Two
how
things
about-
I would say to be concerned about. One is, I don't like the idea of the legislature deciding any of this.
Yeah.
I think I don't disagree. If a parent wants to opt out their kid, they can opt out their kid. Who says they can't? Why do we need a law that now says they can? The only people that are going to have to deal with this are schools. And what if they say they want to opt out of their senior Regents exam? Or they want to opt out of their end of quarter teacher written tests? I just think, personally, the more we involve the legislature, we have a second bureaucratic body micromanaging schools. So what parent can't keep their kid from taking a
Right.
test? Why do we need the legislature to waste their time on this when maybe they could do something useful?
Waste your time on something else.
Yeah,
So,
waste their time on something
sounds like
else.
there's consensus just to let this one die on the vine.
I'd be happy to support you and Scott if you feel that by proposing an amendment, you can focus on the real issue here, which I don't necessarily think is
This does.
parent being qualified for these decisions, but if the debate is on the terms set forth here, I would not support it.
Right, and I agree, I think it's political.
All right, well, let's see what happens with it. And, you know, I hear what you're saying, and, you know, I'm not
I think the reason.
dying to support it.
Yeah, well, and look, we can, if the consensus is not to, then of course we won't. I think that the one point I would make, though, is that the reason that I think other states have done this is because despite the fact that we can sit here and say that a parent can keep their kid home, there's still a tremendous amount of question around the ultimate repercussions for them
You see,
as it relates to
I
state government.
understand
That's the
that,
issue.
but I have this curmudgeonly thinking about it, that I do believe that public school districts really do try to act in the best interest of the student in terms of these type of things. And if my superintendent, who is in charge of my district, really believes that things are advanced in this way, I will support that. Putting aside, I think, to be just the illogical premises behind this. That all said, and I mean this sincerely, you and Brenda put a lot of work into this, and if the debate goes in a certain direction and you think you can be helpful with amendments, whatever, I say go have it. I'm not looking to tie anybody's hands at all, but I think you've asked for our views on these, and give them to you.
Well, this resolution talks about with the support from the local school district, as
Which we
Robin
wouldn't say,
pointed out.
yeah.
Yeah.
And you know what? It may be that the interpretation is that now if a third grade teacher agrees with a parent that this is way too much for this kid at this time, that they're not completely prohibited from recommending to the parent or agreeing with the parent, yeah, I think you should hold off on this. The kid's traumatized by this
So
stuff.
part of our goal to give every kid an IEP.
Right, I was just gonna say, that's where that would come in.
Yeah.
But look, these are interesting topic, but
Yeah,
I tell you, this
No.
is the only thing that's really getting the governor's attention.
this one,
Opting, not
Oh,
this
the opting
resolution,
out.
the
The opt-outs.
opting out.
It-
That is
Yeah.
why he's back to the table with, you know what, maybe we did
Well, then it's
push
working-
this Common Core stuff, implementation a
It's
little
working
too
the
fast.
parents'
I thought poll
working the
ratings weren't
advocacy.
helping his position either. They were tanking lately, as I saw.
it's working with the advocacy groups,
Yeah.
PTSA advocacy groups.
And I agree with you, Ira, it's something that people can grab onto, maybe not necessarily for the right reason,
And it's
but
a
it's
re-
getting Albany's attention.
It's also, to me, in the overall, a relatively new issue. A lot of these issues come up year after year, maybe dressed in different clothing, but this issue now with the ELA and the opt-out really grabbed hold last year. And so now districts are processing it. That's fine.
Yeah, but state tests were only required every year since 2005, I think.
No, but this now.
Right, the opt-out.
The opt-out is something.
It
and-
started
So this could
as
be
a
a little reactive.
grassroots
And it is,
movement.
but
It's
and
now
I
going
think it's a
mainstream.
discussion that should continue. I think it's a discussion should continue on the state level, the local level. I think West Putt has a voice in it, and it's great. But again, my view has been stated on how I feel about 29.
Okay.
Well, I appreciate your discussion on these points.
Yep.
All right, and-
We appreciate
yeah,
your
thank-
work.
thank you. Yes,
We do. We
both of
appreciate
you,
your work a lot on
Thank
this.
you so
Thank
much,
you.
and thank you for representing our district to vote on these.
It's very helpful.
So, all right, and sounds like then, even though we have one more meeting in between this and the vote of that, it sounds like we can put this
Yeah.
to bed unless you have any other
Nope.
questions, you can bring it up at our next meeting. And we can move on. Thank you both very, very much. Okay, and that brings us to item 10.3, acceptance of a special by Rappels Education Foundation Fall 2015 grant. And this is different than what we approved in consent, because this is much bigger. Much different.
I'll move to accept the grant.
And a second?
Second.
Okay, and do you want to?
Yeah, this is very exciting, for the last, last year actually was the first year that the foundation offered what's called dedicated giving. Prior to last year, if you made a contribution to the Education Foundation, it would go into the general fund, and during the course of the year, grants would come in, and the Education Foundation would dole out the money, for lack of a better term. This is something, and I want to recognize Mike and Scott here. Talk of this got started back when Mike was leading the foundation, and it actually came to fruition last year under Scott and was tremendously successful. So the foundation came back this year and said they would like to have another dedicated giving plan. We put together a grant for $90,000, and the $90,000 will build on the infrastructure grants of 2 years ago, on the one-to-one computing grant of last year, and will bring STEAM and STEM curriculum to every student in every grade in the district through a variety of different hardware and software elements that are in the grant. Has the potential to be the next big step forward for us. There are a series of steps at this point, but this one is huge, and I have to say the one-to-one computing was so successful that last year, which was supposed to be a pilot, by the end of summer was complete. We have one-to-one computing everywhere that we needed at this point. So STEM and STEAM, we're talking about 3D printers at every grade level, K through 12.
Wow.
Plus a lot of other stuff. There are actually multiple elements for every single grade level. So in my mind, congratulations to the foundation for recognizing the importance of this, and thanks to them for donating.
Ira?
I just think we should take a second to realize how lucky we are. That most districts can only dream of this. They can only dream of doing this for their students, doing this for the teachers, and we almost do it, I don't want to say as a matter of course, but almost
like
as a
it,
matter
yeah.
of course. We're very fortunate. Mike, thank you for your leadership on this as it percolated up. This is really a watershed grant, I think, in terms of what we're doing in the classroom and for our students. So I'm just thrilled. I'm thrilled about this.
I would like to add that the work that the administration put into, initiating this project, I think, was really great. And from both Scott and my standpoint, being at that meeting, it was a very good presentation. There was lots of dialogue around it. But I think the amount of energy and time that went into it by your team, Bill, was obvious, and it's very exciting.
Yeah, and this was planned out over quite some time. Had initial discussions with the foundation back in the spring, and I think that it epitomizes what the foundation wants to do, which is be innovative and at the forefront and take the infrastructure to the next level to give kids these outstanding learning experiences. This is all about coding and creativity, and it's exactly what so many of our graduates are going to do when they go to college. So it just makes so much sense to start in kindergarten and work your way up. And that's the other thing about this grant, it will touch every grade. So I think there's a lot of excitement for it.
That's good. That's good.
Now, can you talk to us a little bit about the timing? This is different timing than usual.
Timing is necessary for the dedicated giving. The bulk of the giving that's not associated with an event like the gala happens in time for the charitable tax donations for your 2015 taxes. So normally we don't process grants until January, which was always too late for tax giving.
Okay.
So the combination of having dedicated giving and in time for taxes is really, I guess it's a two-pronged.
2 for 1.
So
Yeah.
if the board accepts it, then the foundation plans to start the process of marketing and communicating to the
Immediately.
community really in the next
Oh, I see, so
window, in the
the
next
money's
couple.
not sitting there right now then, or you're going to fill the coffers with it, with the marketing once it's approved?
Right.
So we're approving the idea of it tonight, or the actual?
No, they're
grant?
guaranteeing
No,
the
they're-
gift.
yes.
You're guaranteeing.
They're guaranteeing the
Okay.
gift.
Yeah, which is the same procedure we went through last year, but then last year we were very successful in the directed giving and got to our threshold.
Okay.
They're confident they
Within,
can
yeah,
put
within the annual appeal, it's our understanding that the donors will be able to select whether it goes to this project or the general pool
Okay.
of the foundation. So the idea is that from a, a standpoint, families in town, if they're very interested in technology, can be motivated around funding this project.
It's really brilliant, it's really innovative. Great.
Move to accept with gratitude.
I have a question first of all. We should know what kind of impact will this have on future budgets for us? Because it sounds like this is a grant, but then traditionally, we just like to know if there's, financial implications down the road. Is this something?
No serious financial implications. Some of this software will need to be updated from time to time, but it's not committing us to any immediate costs, really.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Okay, then we have a motion on the table. All in favor of accepting the grant?
With gratitude.
With gratitude, thank you. And thank you to all the families out there that donate to this grant as well. We are a lucky district.
Yeah.